Hey folks, in this video I'm going to introduce Roland Barthes' book Mythologies from 1957. The way I want to talk about this book is primarily as a work of semiotics. Formally speaking, semiotics is the study of signs, but you can just think of it as the study of how words and images come to have meanings. And importantly, Roland Barthes' Mythologies and much of his writing after that book is better described as a semiotics of culture. The field of semiotics comes out of a particular way of understanding language that we get from Ferdinand de Saussure, a French linguist. We'll talk a little bit about how Barthes draws from this thinker, but it's important to keep in mind that Barthes is talking about culture, not just language. So to get a good impression of what this book is all about, it's pretty revealing to look at the table of contents. You'll see that it's broken up into two parts. The first part consists of a bunch of small essays that were written before the publication of this book on various topics looking at ordinary objects of mass culture. And that's really part of the fun of this book, is looking at these 2, 3, 4-page essays that say some really interesting things about ordinary social phenomena like wrestling, soap powders and detergents, margarine, Albert Einstein, and in particular Einstein's brain, plastic, and wine and milk. So you might be asking yourself, what could Barthes possibly say about these seemingly random sorts of objects? The kinds of things that you might not think about, but otherwise come across in your day-to-day life. Well, one of the questions that we might say that Barthes is asking is this. He's asking, what associations do we tend to have with these ordinary objects of popular culture? What associations do we tend to have with wine in our particular culture? And it's really from this question that we get the central concept of the book Mythologies, which is what Barthes calls myth. Now keep in mind that the word myth, as it's used by Barthes throughout the book, is rather slippery, and it comes to be used in a number of different ways, but for right now, let's just define myth this way. You might think of myth for Barthes as the associations or culturally constructed meanings or values attached to signs. And signs includes images, everyday objects, and practices within a particular society. It's also important to note that these meanings often reinforce dominant ideologies within a society. And the first thing that I think we should ask is, why does Barthes choose an already existing word, a concept, myth, to discuss this new idea? So we usually use the word myth to describe these ancient stories that usually explain some fundamental phenomena. Think about creation myths of ancient Greece. Think about the myth of Pandora's box, or the myth of Icarus flying too close to the sun. What's the relationship between what Barthes is trying to do with these ordinary objects in mass culture and these old myths? So I think there's two things that we can say. Number one, myths are stories that help explain the world, and they often contain messages through stories. So Barthes will say, what must be firmly established at the start is that myth is a system of communication, that it is a message. Just like you might say the message of the myth of Icarus, who flies too close to the sun and melts his wax wings, is something like, beware of unchecked ambition. You might say that the mass cultural myths that Barthes is looking at are also messages. The second thing that ties myths as old stories to these mass cultural myths attached to objects and signs is something like this. Myths are not natural. They are created by people and are unique to particular cultures and particular points in history. Think about that myths often try to explain things that we come to think of as natural. Right? When Pandora opens the box in the ancient Greek myth, she is releasing all of the evils into the world. The fact that bad things happen is just something that is part of our world, and this myth sort of explains how bad things came into the world. The important thing to remember is that people sat down and wrote this myth. The very fact of bad things existing might be natural, but what's not natural is this story of Pandora opening a box. So Barthes says, ancient or not, mythology can only have an historical foundation. It cannot possibly evolve from the nature of things. So again and again, you'll see this idea that myths are not natural. They make things seem natural, but they themselves are creations of human beings. So now that we have a kind of abstract idea of what myth means for Barthes, and also why maybe the word myth was chosen by Barthes to describe this new concept that he is creating, let's look at an example. Examples will always make Barthes' semiotic analysis a lot easier to understand. And lucky for us, at the end of this book, he has a large chapter called Myth Today. Important to keep in mind that this was written years after these small essays on these random little things within culture. And this is really the theory chapter of the book, where he tries to apply theoretical ideas to what he has been doing in those earlier chapters. And this is where he'll tell us that he's drawing a lot from the work of Ferdinand de Saussure, who is the father of semiotics and structuralist thought. I have another video that explains in more detail the thought of Saussure and how Barthes might have been attracted to those ideas. But keep in mind that Saussure's central contribution to the study of language was to imagine the way that words come to mean the things that they mean. So the utterance tree, as it comes out of my mouth, is what he called a signifier, and the idea of tree that comes to my mind when I hear the word is what he called a signified. And one of Saussure's main observations was to say that there is nothing natural about the connection between the sound tree and the concept tree. And you might say that what Saussure is doing in that book is studying denotation. That is, how it is that words at all come to mean the things that they mean in the most basic way. When I hear tree, how is it that I come to understand the idea or concept of a tree? Barthes is not looking at language on this fundamental level. He is not looking at denotation. He is looking at what he'll call later connotation. So the kind of question that he's interested in this book is not, say, how does the word tree come to mean the idea of tree, but rather, what does it mean that in this particular ad, say for Patagonia, we have this large tree? What kind of signifying work is that tree doing within the culture that that ad is part of? Now, lucky for us, Barthes in this essay, Myth Today, gives us his own analysis, not of an ad, but something very similar. It's the cover of a magazine. Basically trying to ask the question, what does this magazine cover mean in a semiotic way? And he's looking at this cover and he says, on the cover, a black child in a French uniform is saluting with his eyes uplifted, probably fixed on a fold of the French flag. All this is the meaning of the picture. So this is where he begins, and we might even map this reading onto a classic Saussurean division between signifier and signified. The signifier in this case might consist of a number of little signifiers. One is the gesture of saluting. The other is the fact that the child is in a recognizably French military uniform. If I see the uniform plus the gesture of saluting, I will say, oh, this child is saluting a flag, in particular, likely a French flag, given the context. This is purely at the level of denotation. And this is the kind of analysis that Saussure would have spent a lot of time really thinking about. For example, like, how is it that I came to learn this random gesture of my hand reaching to my head comes to mean a salute, in particular a military salute? There's something natural about the connection between hand to head and the military. I was born in a society that made that association between this gesture and what it means part of my general cultural knowledge. If we want to take one step further in moving into connotation, but not quite the level of connotation that Barthes wants to get, we might say that putting a child saluting a flag on the cover of a French magazine signifies a love of country or patriotism. That is one of the main impressions that I'm getting from this image. But Barthes wants to take things way further. He continues his analysis and he says, but whether naively or not, I see very well what it signifies to me, that France is a great empire, that all her sons, without any color discrimination, faithfully serve under her flag, and that there is no better answer to the detractors of an alleged colonialism than the zeal shown by this black child in serving his so-called oppressors. It's important to keep in mind a context that we might not be aware of. This is France in 1957. At this point, France's empire was disintegrating. France has a long history of colonialism in North Africa, and at this point in the 1950s, there was a lot of military conflict in France's North African colony of Algeria, where black Algerians fought for independence. This is something that a French audience in the 1950s would have been very aware of. It would have been on their minds. It was very much in the media. And so Barthes is suggesting that within this context of 1950s France, a black child in a French military uniform saluting the French flag cannot help but be understood within the context of France's colonialism. And what it's saying is that, hey, even a black French child, someone who might have a particular stake in France's history of colonialism in North Africa, is shown loving France. Thus, we might say he is also loving the result of French colonialism. There is no problem here. So if we think about it in terms of signifier and signified, let's go back to signifier. In this case, our signifiers will be a little bit different. Instead of just the idea of the signifier being, say, the fact of saluting, the gesture of saluting, now Barthes is saying you can't ignore the signifier of the child's blackness, his racial identity. They could have chosen a white child, but they did not. They chose a black child. And if you pair that racial signifier with the context of France in the 1950s, and what's going on in Algeria and the history of French colonialism, what you get is a very different signified. In this case, you get something like French colonial rule is fair and egalitarian. And in other words, you get a kind of message that tries to absolve France of its sins that come with colonialism. This is the mythic signification that Barthes is interested in. It goes beyond that initial denotation and even that soft connotation we talked about earlier. It's the level of myth. And this is how Barthes himself will talk about it. I find this quite useful. He says, what is got rid of in the magazine cover is certainly not French imperiality. It is the contingent, historical, fabricated quality of colonialism. Myth does not deny things. On the contrary, its function is to talk about them. Simply, it purifies them. It makes them innocent. It gives them a natural and eternal justification. It gives them a clarity which is not that of explanation, but that of a statement of fact. If I state the fact of French imperiality without explaining it, I am very near to finding that it is natural and goes without saying. So what Barthes is trying to clarify here is to say that, hey, if you look back at this magazine cover, it is not trying to suppress the idea of French colonialism. It's not trying to portray the false reality of a world in which France never touched the continent of Africa. Instead, what it's trying to do is something far more insidious for Barthes. It's trying to make French colonialism seem fine, seem natural. In other words, we might say myths make social realities that should be up for debate seem perfectly natural. And the aim of analyzing myth is to remove that impression of naturalness by showing how the myth is constructed. Seeing a black child in a French uniform saluting the flag will call to mind colonialism, but it will call to mind French colonialism in a way that makes it not something up for debate, something natural, something that's part of the world, something that always would have happened, something that makes sense, and something that we live with without question. That's the myth. So once again, I want to reinforce that second part of the definition of myth that I offered earlier. These meanings attached to signs often reinforce dominant ideologies within a society. Barthes will always remind us when he's doing an analysis of myth, he will always ask, who does this myth benefit? He will say that myths tend to benefit those who hold power. Okay, so that's the most famous example that Barthes gives us in the chapter Myth Today, and it's something that, frankly, almost all the commentaries on Barthes' mythologies will go over. But I don't want to end there. I want to kind of offer my own example in the spirit of looking at some of these ordinary objects that Barthes tends to look at. Margarine, the brain of Einstein, plastic, and last but not least, wine and milk. So I want to go back to that question I asked earlier. What associations do we tend to have with these ordinary objects of popular culture? If Barthes just gave us an example of looking at a particular print ad, are not really doing close analysis of individual objects, most of them are doing a kind of more distanced analysis of general social phenomena. Wrestling, margarine, wine and milk. So I want to do an example analysis of wine in the spirit of Barthes to give you a flavor of what that might look like. So I first want to acknowledge that when Barthes is doing his analysis, when he's saying what associations do we tend to have with these ordinary objects, he does not mean we in the universal sense. He means we always in the historically and socially contingent sense. He's talking about France in the 1950s. But I'm not from France in the 1950s. I'm from the United States in the 21st century. And I want to offer a few associations that my context has with wine. Not a particular image of wine, just wine in general. So what associations do we, in the American context, have with wine? So what comes to mind is stuff like that wine is sophisticated, that it's bourgeois, or associated with a particular middle and upper middle class. I also think we associate wine with fine dining. It's not in my interest to examine where these cultural associations came from. For now, I just want to say that these associations are there and hope that you'll agree with me. But I want to demonstrate some semiotic methods of thought. And I want to note that these associations with wine only exist partly because they're in tension with the associations I have with another beverage, that is beer. If wine is sophisticated, beer is ordinary. If wine is bourgeois, beer is working class, or at least not as markedly bourgeois as wine. If I associate wine with fine dining, I think that we can associate beer with burgers and wings and the kind of food that you might eat at a Super Bowl party. In comparing the associations between wine and beer and saying that my associations with wine get stronger only by virtue of their opposition to the associations I have with beer, I'm drawing a bit on Saussure's basic concept about how meaning gets generated in language. He says, concepts are purely differential and defined not by their positive content, but negatively by their relations with other terms in the system. I talk about this more at length in another video, but for now I just want to consider an analogy between the fact that for Saussure, the way we come to understand concepts in general, say what is a dog, what is a lion, what is a glass of wine, what is a glass of beer, we come to understand those concepts by opposing them to the other related concepts that we might put in a family of concepts, like beverages or mammals. And now I want to say the cultural associations we have with particular concepts or objects or signs also depends on the opposition with things that they are not. This is a particularly structuralist way of thinking. And now I want to add maybe some less obvious associations that I think we have in the American context with wine and beer. And this one concerns gender. If you Google image search drinking beer and drinking wine, these are the images that are going to come up. Predominantly the images of people drinking beer will be men. Predominantly the images of people drinking wine will be women. There are plenty of exceptions, of course, but I think this slight gender division between wine and beer, while not of course absolute, is something that I think an American would recognize by thinking of the kinds of ads that they see, the images that they consume, and the general cultural associations that we tend to have with wine and with beer. Think about wine moms as a phrase that has cropped up on the internet and is part of mass culture in the last, say, 5-6 years. Or the idea of the IPA guy or the IPA bro and the associations that we have with India Pale Ale, which you can Google about if you're curious. There's a gendered component to these micro-cultural differences. So we might add women and men to this cultural division between wine and beer. Now, so far, I'm not saying that there's anything wrong or ideologically suspicious about this division. I'm just trying to rack up some of the cultural associations we have with these two drinks. Where might we find the myth that often reinforces dominant ideologies within a society? Well, here's a simple example of that. An American might recognize something that Wikipedia has called the beer question. The beer question, according to Wikipedia, is a thought experiment in politics that attempts to measure authenticity and likability in politicians by asking or polling voters about which politicians they would prefer to drink beer with. I myself never actually heard of this referred to as the beer question, but as an American, I have definitely heard the phrase, which candidate would you prefer to have a beer with? Sit down and drink a beer with. So I mentioned earlier that the cultural associations we have between wine and beer weren't necessarily bad or supporting the dominant ideology. But now that we can clearly locate a connection between the most powerful person in American office, the president, and one of these drinks, there might be something here worth subjecting to a Barthes-style mythic analysis. And in fact, the Wikipedia entry for beer question offers this same critique. Or it at least suggests that this critique has been made in popular culture. It says, the beer question has been criticized for the gender bias implicit in referencing a predominantly male drinking culture. In other words, if we live in a society that associates beer with a particular gender, and we also have a cultural value in that society that associates beer with the most powerful person in office, well, then we have something of an inherent problem. Or to put it in Barthes' terms, we have a cultural myth. That is attached to the masculine association we have in this context with beer with political power. And just to reinforce Barthes' point that there's nothing natural about these associations, I want to draw your attention to a passage in Barthes' own essay about wine, where he comes to a very different conclusion. He in fact says that the president at the time, René Coty, was shown in a photograph with beer, and it made everyone mad. He says, Coty Having allowed himself to be photographed at the beginning of his 7 years presidency, sitting at home before a table on which a bottle of beer seemed to replace, by an extraordinary exception, the familiar liter of red wine, the whole nation was in a flutter. It was as intolerable as having a bachelor king. Wine is here a part of the reason of state. So what's super interesting here is that in Barthes' cultural analysis of wine, he describes wine as the national drink of the country of France. He describes it as having an almost magical quality. It's somehow both the ideal drink for being refreshed in the summer and also staying warm in the winter. It's sophisticated, but it's not too sophisticated. It has this magical association in France. And so by extension, you would only want to have your president shown drinking wine. That's a very different context from my American one, where there are not only pictures of American presidents drinking beer, but there are these deep cultural values that measure the likability of a president based on your ability to imagine yourself having a beer with him. And I say him on purpose. So this is the way that Barthes reflects upon this kind of analysis at the very beginning of his book in a preface. He says the starting point of these reflections, the reflections on wine, on wrestling, on margarine, was usually a feeling of impatience at the sight of the naturalness with which newspapers, art, and common sense constantly dress up a reality which, even though it is the one we live in, is undoubtedly determined by history. So to put it in context of the beer question, it might seem perfectly natural if I talk to a bunch of Americans that in order to imagine the likability of my president, I do not sit and imagine myself drinking wine with him. I imagine myself drinking beer with him. That just seems natural. And what I'm trying to demonstrate here is that not only is it not natural, it smuggles in a host of ideological assumptions that serve one group of people over another. In this case, men versus women. So I want to end with a kind of broad general statement about the function of myth and its relationship to this idea of the natural. And this is from a commentator on Barthes, Jonathan Bunyell, in his book, Media Semiotics. He says the function of ideology is to make the existing system appear natural and acceptable to us all. Myth, for Barthes, is a type of speech about social realities which supports ideology by taking these realities outside of the arena of political debate. All right, that's all I have for this introduction to mythologies, and I'll see you next time.